Gentleman yields back. Mr. Swalwell, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can each of you assure the American people that you have fully searched your platforms and disclosed to this committee every Russian effort to influence the 2016 election? Mr. Edgett.
We've provided everything we have to date, and we're continuing to look at this. So there will be more information that we share.
Mr. Stretch.
The same is true, particularly in connection with, as I mentioned earlier, some of the threat sharing that the companies are now engaged in.
Mr. Walker.
Yes, we have done both a review of the leads we have received and generated ourselves, and then cross-checked against other indicators that we've developed.
So there could be more to come. Is that right?
The investigations do continue. That's correct.
Over my right shoulder are two of the ads that have been disclosed. One was a RT one invoking WikiLeaks. The other was a RT ad invoking Donald Trump and the debate. Can you just give me a yes or no? Have you run an analysis as to whether these ads were posted in duplicate form from non-Russia sources? And what I mean is, knowing that the Russians use cutouts sometimes, have you done a pixel analysis to determine whether some other source posted this exact same ad? Yes or no, Mr. Edgett?
Sorry, the answer is I'm not sure, but I'll follow up with you.
Thank you. Mr. Stretch. And I'm talking about every ad that you've disclosed. Have you done a duplicate analysis?
I would have to follow up with you, Congressman.
Thank you. Mr. Walker.
Same answer.
And do you share a concern that perhaps that analysis has not been done and that the Russians did use cutouts and that there are far more ads out there that they used beyond the 120+ million views that occurred than what we know about?
We did try to link accounts and look across a number of identifiers, so it may have picked up things like this. We were trying to be as exhaustive in our search as we could. I can't answer the question if we looked to see if they were promoting the same news from other more legitimate looking sites.
We'll follow up.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Edgett. Do each of you believe that your companies and other social media platforms have a duty going forward to report to the FBI if you see foreign election interference activity before they do? Mr. Edgett?
We are working with the FBI constantly and notifying them of illegal activity or taking threat information from them.
Mr. Stretch, do you believe that that duty now exists, now that we know, to warn them?
Yes, we believe that's really an area of potential improvement, and also we're hopeful that we'll receive threat information that the Bureau is aware of as well.
Thank you. Mr. Walker?
Again, I agree.
And did any of your companies return ad revenue to the Russians, meaning that did they make money on this? Mr. Walker?
So in some cases, we had sites such as RT that would show ads against their content, and they made money from those ads. That's correct. It's the same is true beyond the internet, of course, because RT is featured on cable stations, satellite stations, hotel television networks. They buy advertising in newspapers, magazines, airports, etc.
So if I understand this right, Russia ran an interference campaign, attacked our democracy, sought to undermine our ability to choose, and they made money on it?
So RT shows advertising on all the platforms we've discussed, on cable, satellite, internet, etc. And presumably, yes, they monetize those ads.
Mr. Stretch. And Mr. Walker, I mean, did Google pay RT part of your ad revenue back?
The money comes from advertisers. Google gets a small percentage of that. The majority of it goes to the publisher.
But some of it did go back to RT?
That's correct.
Mr. Stretch.
The ads we've been discussing were all paid for and didn't generate any revenue from Facebook. I will say that the approximately $100,000 and then quite a bit more we have contributed to the Defending Digital Democracy project that's focused on, in a bipartisan way, on election security and protection.
Thank you. Mr. Edgett.
No, we didn't pay RT for any of this content. In fact, we've banned them as an advertiser, and we're donating the revenue we receive to further education and academic research around the use of Twitter.
Great. And Mr. Chairman, I'm entering into the record Exhibits A and B, additional Facebook and Instagram advertisements that will be available to the public beyond what we show today, and the Twitter handles turned over to use by the company connected to the Internet Research Agency, and ask for unanimous support to do that. And thank you again. I believe that our democracy was attacked by the Russians in this last election. They infected our political process with a virus that we have not yet kicked. I believe the best antidote is to strengthen our defenses, particularly in the social media platforms that they used, and we need your help to do that. And I yield back.
Mr. Swalwell, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for the second round. Can I ask each of you, do you believe that Russian intelligence services are still today on your platforms? Mr. Edgett, yes or no?
I think there's a possibility, and we're working to find them.
Mr. Stretch?
The same is true.
And Mr. Walker?
Yes, sir. Same.
And Mr. Edgett, Twitter recently decided not to run RT ads on its platform. Is your assessment that RT pushed what we might call fake news on Twitter?
That was part of the assessment.
And was part of your assessment also that they pushed stolen information from the DNC and the Clinton, John Podesta's emails?
That wasn't part of the assessment to offboard them, no.
But you agree that RT was pushing that propaganda?
I saw them reporting on that in some of their promoted tweets.
And Mr. Walker, going back to our earlier conversation, from the disclosures we have from Google, we have 1,100 videos that RT posted spanning 43 hours of content on YouTube. And you did mention earlier that some money was returned through ad revenue sharing to RT. How much money was returned to RT as it related to ads that related to election interference?
Yeah, if I could just clarify, the 1,100 ads, the 1,100 videos we referred to were separate. Those were ads that were connected with this other disinformation campaign or sort of deceptive ads with no disclosure of source. So with regard to those ads, I think there was a minimal amount of advertising revenue received. And
Do you have a number for that?
we can provide that information to the committee, but it was de minimis, I believe.
Okay. Do you understand the concern, though, that ad revenue that the Russians are receiving back from U.S. companies as they interfere in our campaign could be used to buy ads, for example, on platforms like Facebook or on Twitter, and you've essentially have a feedback loop where they can continue to try and interfere?
Yeah, certainly there's a risk anytime anybody monetizes the platform that they can misuse the proceeds of their advertising. Yes.
And having reviewed the propaganda ads that each of you have disclosed, would you agree that as it related to candidates Trump and Clinton, that the theme generally went like this? If they invoked either candidate, the ads were pro-Trump and anti-Clinton. Would you agree with that, Mr. Edgett?
That's generally what we saw in our assessment.
Mr. Stretch?
For the ads that ran prior to the election, that's generally accurate.
And Mr. Walker?
We did not see expressed advocacy ads. Again, we had a very limited number of ads, something like $4,700 worth. The ads we saw, I would describe as socially divisive rather than being pro or anti-candidate.
Sure. I also want to point out that we found propaganda that was being expressed by the Russians, not just during the general election campaign, but also during the primaries. Here is a July 21st, 2016 ad. At this point, Donald Trump is about to be the nominee for the Republican Party. There's questions about whether it'll be contended at the RNC convention, and RT is propagating a Ted Cruz story about Ted Cruz being booed for speaking as if he's running for president. And so I guess I would just point out to my Republican colleagues that if this interference campaign has taught us anything, is that the Russians don't care. They're not pro-Republican. They're not anti-Democrat. They're just pro-Russian. And in this election, they happened to find a candidate who was also very much pro-Russian. And so I hope that moves all of us to understand that in the next election, for whatever reason, the Russians or another country's intelligence service may be anti-Republican, and that my Republican colleagues, too, could be subject to attack, just as we saw in a smaller, less significant way that one of their own presidential candidates was part of Russia's propaganda campaign. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.